Apple just made its second biggest acquisition ever, and why it's actually a good move. Fresh iPhone 18 Pro and iPhone Fold updates. New Apple products dropped this week, and there's some things that you might have missed. Updates on the upcoming MacBook Pro with a touchscreen and an OLED display, and much more, all in today's episode of Apple Weekly. Okay, so Apple just made its second biggest acquisition ever, and it's from a stealth startup called QAI. So this is an Israeli startup that developed proprietary technology that might be used to shape Apple's wearables of the future. So you might be wondering the price here. Well, that was $2 billion. The only other acquisition that was larger was Beats back in 2014 for $3 billion. So why did Apple pay so much for QAI? Well, this is interesting technology. So it's basically technology that's used in headphones and glasses, and it uses facial skin micro movements to communicate without talking. So what it does is it analyzes your facial expressions to understand silent speech. And this system could allow us to have private, non-verbal communication with our wearables, like the Apple glasses that are coming later. So instead of saying, "Hey S," or like talking out loud to your glasses, you'll just be able to make facial expressions and be able to communicate, what you want to do that way without actually verbally saying anything. And this sounds like it could be a big game changer because, I use the Apple Vision Pro, and I use the text to speech, or the speech to text, I should say, on that more than any other device because it's just so cumbersome sometimes to type on that the way you have to do it. So I just use my voice a lot. And if you're out in public or you have other people in the house and you're constantly talking to yourself, that's kind of an issue. So this could be the solution to that. And I would expect Apple to use this type of technology in the Apple glasses. So the first generation Apple glasses are expected to be announced later this year and potentially released in 2027. So we could see this technology even as early as those Apple glasses. And of course, this will be for the future of Apple wearables as well. So $2 billion, if it does what it seems like it's going to do, that could be a really good deal. And I think it's actually a great move for Apple to purchase, a company like this with this type of technology. And speaking of AI, Mark Gurman just recently revealed that Apple basically runs on Anthropic at this point. Not Google Gemini, because everybody knows they just had that big deal with Google Gemini, but Apple actually runs on Anthropic mostly, which is quite interesting. So he said this in an interview with TBPN. He said, Apple runs on Anthropic at this point. Anthropic is powering a lot of the stuff Apple is doing internally in terms of product development, a lot of their internal tools. They have custom versions of Claude running on their own servers internally. This Google deal just came together a few months ago. They were not going to use Google. Apple actually was going to rebuild Siri around Claude, but Anthropic was holding them over a barrel. They wanted a ton of money from them, several $billion a year, and at a price that doubled on an annual basis for the next 3 years. And of course, comparably, we see that Google Gemini, that deal was roughly around $1 billion. That's what's rumored per year. So much cheaper than what Anthropic was trying to pitch to Apple. So I think Apple at that point should have just bought out the company, but that's a story for another day. But yeah, it seems very interesting that Apple is still running Anthropic, on the back end. And I don't think it's completely off the table for Apple to purchase them at some point in the future. Also this week, Apple launched the Apple Creator Studio Bundle, which is a new subscription service from Apple that's $13 a month or $130 a year. And this gets you Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro, Pixelmator Pro, Motion Compressor, and Mainstage, along with new AI features and Keynote pages and numbers. Now, I did sign up for the subscription this week and I did use it a little bit, but to me personally, it's not really worth it because I already have a one-time purchase for the applications that I would need, like Final Cut Pro, Logic Pro. I've already made that one-time purchase, and the AI features that are included in the subscription to me aren't really worth it. So, I will be canceling that, but it is a good option if you're somebody who's maybe not going to use these applications for life. Maybe it's just like a temporary thing. It could be useful for that, and especially for students. Now, I have to say, although I didn't love the new AI features in the Pro applications, the new AI features in Keynote pages and numbers are actually very impressive. So in Pages, you get premium templates and you can upscale images. Numbers, you get a really cool magic fill feature that works really well. And also in Keynote, you can create entire slide decks with just a prompt. And if you want to see Creator Studio in action, Mac Vents made a good video on it. I will leave that linked down below. Also this week, Apple did launch the AirTag 2, so I did make a full video comparing that to the original AirTag. And I've since used it and been testing it pretty much every day since it came out on Wednesday. And I have to say that the range is definitely better, like precision finding definitely better. The speaker speaker is also noticeably better when I test it, so that is good to hear. Now, the teardown also revealed that the speaker coil is slightly larger than the first generation, and the speaker magnet is more secure inside. There's more like adhesive where it sticks to. So it is a little bit harder to take out, but it's not impossible. So I wouldn't really call it tamper proof because you can still tamper with it. And also what's interesting is that when you remove the speaker coil and the magnet, it's still able to connect to an iPhone. So it's still not fully anti-stock proof yet. Okay, so now let's talk about the MacBook Pros, because we got a fresh report from Mark Gurman this week that talks about the MacBook Pros and how they're going to be updated twice this year. And plus, there's a lot of other Macs coming. So in this report, Gurman says there are a lot of updated Macs coming in 2026, bringing major new features, designs, and sales strategies. The lineup will include MacBook Pros and MacBook Airs, a revamped MacBook Pro with an OLED screen and touch support, a Mac Mini and Mac Studio, an entirely new low-cost MacBook running an iPhone-grade chip, and even the first update to the Apple Studio display in several years. Versions of the MacBook Pros, MacBook Air, and Mac Studio with bumped up specs, as well as the new display, are planned for the first half of the year. The revamped MacBook Pro should be hitting towards the end of 2026. And here's the interesting part. I think the M6 chip is potentially coming sooner than people anticipate, not necessarily in these next laptops, but still in the near future in some configurations. Apple released the M5 processor in October in 3 devices. Though it might seem soon for an M6, there was only a 5-month gap between the M3 and M4. So I find that very interesting that Gurman is also expecting the M6 to come earlier than expected. So could we see that more in the middle of the year versus the end of the year like we were expecting? So that's quite interesting to hear. Now, also a lot of people have asked me about the M5 Pro and M5 Max MacBook Pros because people thought those are supposed to come in January. Well, actually, there were no credible reports saying that these new MacBook Pros were coming in January. So that was kind of just all people, thinking and just assuming it was going to come based on Creator Studio and things like that. It was never actually expected in the beginning of January. However, we could see it at some point in February or March. Gurman did not actually mention any type of release date for the higher end M5 MacBook Pros, but I would not be surprised to see those at some point in February or March. I don't think Apple's going to wait all the way until June to release those, because that's when we could see potentially the first M6 MacBook Pro, if it's not going to be later on in the year. There's also an interesting update on the iPhone 18 Pro, because we're now hearing that it might feature a teleconverter and a variable aperture for the camera. And this comes from Smart Pikachu, so he says that the new variable aperture camera system for the 18 Pros has reached the late stage engineering sample stage. So the teleconverter is also under evaluation for the upcoming iPhone. So you might not be aware of this, but a teleconverter is basically a zoom multiplier. So it makes your subject look closer without you physically being closer. But the trade-off is that you lose light. So this is most likely why it's going to be paired with that variable aperture system for the next iPhone, because the variable aperture system lets the camera control how much light comes in optically, which is especially important for video, because by cutting light at the lens instead of digitally, it helps maintain natural motion blur and smoother exposure, even in really bright conditions. So this could make the camera a good bit better on the 18 Pros, especially when it comes to video. And speaking of the iPhone 18 Pro and really all Apple products, especially Macs, a lot of people have been worried about the prices increasing because of the recent surge in the price of memory. Well, we have an update on that from Ming-Chi Kuo, who says, don't worry about it. So he says iPhone memory pricing is now negotiated quarterly instead of every 6 months, so expect another hike in the second quarter of 2026. Right now, the second quarter of 2026 quarter-over-quarter increase looks similar to the first quarter. For most non-AI brands, even if you're willing to pay up, there's no guarantee you'll get the supply. The fact that Apple can lock in a deal like this shows just how much leverage they have. Higher memory costs will hit iPhone gross margins, but Apple's playbook is clear. Use the market chaos to their advantage. Secure the chips, absorb the costs, and grab more market share. They'll make it back later on the services side. Apple's current plan for the iPhone 18 is to avoid raising prices as much as possible, at least keep the starting price flat, which is helpful for marketing. Apple has realized that it's not just memory and T-glass. Other components could also run short as their AI server boom continues to squeeze the rest of the supply chain. So that's a relief to hear that we're not expecting any type of price increase increases for the iPhone 18 series, and I would expect the same for the new Macs that come out this year. I would not expect the prices to increase on those either, at least not the starting price. And Apple did also have their earnings call this week, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but I found it interesting that during this earnings call, there were several questions that people asked about memory, and Apple was very vague about it. They didn't really touch much at all on the actual issue of memory and if they're going to increase prices or keep prices the same. So they were very vague, even though they were asked many times about it. And let's go ahead and talk about those earnings, because Apple just had a record-setting quarter this year in the first quarter of 2026. So they had $143.8 billion of revenue, $42.1 billion of profit. And most importantly, if you look at the revenue by geographic segments, Greater China was up by 37.9%. That is a massive jump, especially since it's been just a low spot lately. Like, that's been a concern for a while now with Apple, is that the sales in China are just constantly down. This was a huge boost in China. Now let's talk about the iPhone Fold, because Apple has Samsung scrambling to make a direct competitor to the upcoming iPhone Fold. And you might be thinking, isn't the Z Fold 7, isn't the Z Fold 8, aren't those direct competitors? Well, not exactly, because they don't have the same screen size. And that's what Samsung is going after, because the rumored screen size for the foldable phone from Apple is going to be 5.3 inches when folded, 7.7 inches when unfolded. That's about a 4:3, ratio for that inner display. And according to ET News, Samsung's upcoming wide fold device will have nearly the same display sizes as Apple's to compete directly with them. And they aim to produce about 1 million units of this upcoming wide fold device, which would be Samsung's largest initial production run for a special model in the past 3 years. And this wide fold device is going to debut alongside the Galaxy Z Fold 8 and the Z Flip 8 at Samsung's upcoming Q3 Unpacked event in July. So I find this very interesting for Samsung, because they're going to have so many SKUs now. It's going to be kind of confusing. So the Z Fold 8, they have the Z Flip, they have the Trifold, and now they're going to have the wide fold. So that's going to be 4 foldable devices in the lineup at one time. Talk about confusing. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. If Apple, really sells a lot of these, and then maybe, Samsung's going to be like, okay, we're not selling the Z Fold anymore or the Z Flip anymore. We're just going to continue with this wide fold because Apple proved that it's, the best size for the foldable. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. But it looks like Samsung is planning to compete directly with Apple this year. Now let's talk about a phone coming next year, and that is the next version of the iPhone Air, because we're now hearing that Apple is developing a thinner Face ID hardware module for that iPhone Air 2. And this comes from Instant Digital on Weibo. He says this: the iPhone Air 2 adds an ultra wide angle lens and is placed horizontally. In order to solve the internal space problem, Apple is customizing an ultra thin Face ID component to suppliers. And he added a very interesting edit into this. He says, I guess MacBook will probably use this ultra thin Face ID as well. So I find that last part interesting, because we haven't really heard about Face ID coming to the MacBook at all, or any Mac at all. So Gurman mentioned how Apple was testing this in the past, but it never really reached a stage where it was actually going to be in production and be out to the masses. So that's interesting. Maybe something can change, or maybe this edit is just untrue, but at least we are expecting that in the next iPhone Air, which again is now not expected until 2027. Now, do you want to hear something that sounds like a bad idea? And I'm really glad Apple did not actually, bring this to market. They were actually considering an AI-powered iPhone home screen. So this report comes from The Information, and they said that subordinates of software chief Craig Federighi approached him with proposals for an AI-powered iPhone home screen. The feature would dynamically change the locations of apps on the home screen according to users' needs. Federighi reportedly rejected the idea, believing that it would disorient users, many of whom rely on knowing the fixed location of apps on their home screen for quick access. And I completely agree with Craig here. I think that would be a terrible idea to have your apps change literally every single day, like the location change every single day, just based on how you use them. I'm somebody who just uses muscle memory a lot to click on my apps, and I know where they're at. But maybe, obviously I feel like I am in the majority, but maybe I'm not. Like, you guys tell me, would you like this change? Would you like an AI powered home screen? Or are you glad with the way it is now? Okay, so now let's switch over and talk about some software. So let's talk about iOS 26.3 and what in the world is going on with iOS iOS 26.3. Man, this is one of the most confusing iOS updates in quite some time. So we did just recently get the third beta. However, we are still not going to see the final release in January. So for the first time in a very long time, Apple's not going to release the 0.3 update in January. It's for sure coming in February at this point because we don't even have the RC. So of course, by the time you're watching this video, it's already the end of January anyway. So this is very confusing. Now, this week we did also see that something got added to the release notes that's quite interesting. So if you've been facing issues with continuity, you are not alone, because on the iPhone 17 series, iPhone Air, iPad Pro M5, all of those are having issues with continuity simply not working. And if you look in the release notes, Apple mentions these specific features. So iPhone mirroring, AirPlay mirroring to Apple TV, using continuity camera, and sidecar from Mac to iPad Pro M5 specifically. So all of those are completely broken in this third beta of iOS 26.3, which is quite interesting. I've not really seen that at all actually in a beta anytime recently, if at all. So that's an interesting tidbit there. Now, as far as beta 3 overall, like I've been using it for this past week. And again, I've said this before, but I'm not going to sit here and make up things to tell you guys. It's literally the exact same as beta 2 for me. Like I really see no difference at all in performance, battery life, nothing. It's identical to beta 2. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, running a fresh Geekbench, any of that. It's all exactly the same as it was in beta 2. So I would not expect any type of jump there. Like there are backend changes in the code. However, that doesn't really translate to anything physically changing. And when I'm using it on a day-to-day basis, that I'm actually noticing. So yes, there might be changes in the code, and things like that, but don't expect any type of major change going from beta 2 to beta 3. I think if we're going to see a jump at all, it's going to be when going to the RC or the final release. Now, of course, we did see one big change in beta 3, and that was the fact that we have a privacy setting to limit carrier location tracking. Now, this is very limited with the carriers that it works for, but this may roll out gradually to other carriers. And if you didn't see my What's New video where I explained this feature, basically all it does is it reduces the location data that's made available to mobile networks to increase your own privacy. So it's not going to show the carrier networks your exact location. Okay, so now let's talk about when to expect iOS 26.3 and iOS 26.4 beta 1, which of course is going to be a much larger update than 26.3. So next week is going to be February. It's crazy. It's already going to be February 2026, and we're expecting to see iOS 26.3 RC next week, most likely on Monday, February 2nd. Of course, it's Apple, though. It could really be any day at this point, but I would expect it to be on Monday the 2nd. And as far as the final release for iOS 26.3, that's actually possible to come later in the week in February, but typically what Apple does is they release it on a Monday. So it seems like the most likely scenario is Monday, February 9th for iOS 26.3. So we could be seeing iOS 26.4 beta 1 shortly after that, as early as the very next day, potentially later on in the week or even the next week. But I would imagine that since 26.4 is such a big update with the big changes to Siri coming, which is going to be powered by Gemini, Apple's going to want to beta test that as much as possible. So I would not be surprised to see 26.4 beta 1 come out the very next day after iOS 26.3, the final version gets released, most likely on the week of February 9th. And then if you're somebody who does not do the beta updates, you only do the final public releases, you can expect to see iOS 26.4 at some point in late March or into early April. And then finally, we have a crazy AirTag story. So this time, a man's Porsche SUV was stolen in Boston, but thankfully he had an AirTag hidden inside. So when the theft happened, he immediately pulled out his phone, opened up Find My, and called the cops to give them real-time location updates. And thanks to that location tracking, police in Cambridge were able to locate the stolen vehicle near Massachusetts Ave and Albany Street. They tried to pull him over, but the driver took off down Albany Street. And out of concern for public safety, the officers called off the pursuit. They didn't chase him. So once again, without the AirTag, the stolen car could have vanished. But because of Find My and that AirTag, the owner continued to give real-time location updates to police. And moments later, 911 calls started flooding in because the car had crashed into a biotech building. It drove through a tree, a bike rack, a street light, and eventually crashed into the building, pinning a person up against a wall inside. And that innocent person who ended up being seriously injured from the impact was taken to the hospital along with the driver, who was arrested soon after. And the 57-year-old who stole the vehicle faces charges for reckless driving, leaving the scene of an injury crash, unlicensed operation, and receiving a stolen motor vehicle. But once again, like I always say, make sure to put an AirTag in your vehicle. That's probably the number one easiest place to hide an AirTag where people can't find it, because there's so many components, so much area for that. I would recommend putting that inside of your car just so you can track it in case it does get stolen. And of course, unless you have like a Tesla or another car that has location tracking built in. But anyways, guys, that's it for Apple Weekly this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Let me know all your thoughts about any of the stories down in the comments below, and I will see you soon.